Hello, Kindred. Imagine that you are an avid book reader and you find out one of your favorite novelists is coming to town and you know you have to meet her. Imagine later in the day, you talk to your husband and he says, why not interview her? The challenge is her schedule is fully packed, but you just don't know if you don't ask. So join me as I visit with Mary Sharratt and we talk writing strong women back into history and we talk about the sacred feminine, aka wild woman power. So Mary, when I was learning about you, which was actually a couple years ago, I came across your book Illuminations, a novel of Hildegard von Bingen.
Oh, I'm glad you came across that book.
Yeah, and it was interesting because I did so on Facebook. A couple of friends were talking about it. And so
interesting.
Learned about it and read it because she's a personal favorite and icon of mine for about, I don't know, 2 decades, I guess.
Yes, for so many people.
Yeah. And what I wanted to say about that was, from reading the book and learning about you and just your incredible talent as a writer and as an author, which absolutely just fell in love with that book, but then went on to your website, and the thing that I found such a kindred spiritship with you personally was how you described your chosen vocation. As being a woman and an author who writes women back into history.
Yeah, that's my modus operandi. I mean, I think to a large extent, women have been written out of history, and I feel it's my vocation to write them back in, to give voice to the voiceless. And so many great women were lost to history, and I think historical fiction is a very accessible way for us to kind of recover this lost history.
Absolutely. And, you know, at Circle Magica, although we come at things from a different perspective, being an online learning center and sanctuary that celebrates the sacred feminine, I really felt a kinship with the way that you go about telling the stories and who you choose to tell the stories about. For example, with your newest book, which is The Dark Lady's Mask. And how did you go about choosing this wonderful protagonist who, as I understand it, it takes about 4 years to accomplish one of your books. And you're spending a lot of quality time with your protagonists.
Exactly,
And so to feel strong enough that you wanted to bring her story out into the world.
Yes, well, The Dark Lady's Mask is the story of Amelia Bassano-Lanier, who was the first professional English woman writer, the first professional woman writer in England. And some people, such as the late A.L. Rouse, also believe that she was the Dark Lady of Shakespeare's sonnets. And this book was written specifically to be published at the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death, which was April 23rd, 2016, and there were worldwide celebrations to commemorate Shakespeare's legacy. But my question is, what about the women? Why is it that so many intelligent, literate people even struggle to name a single woman writer before Jane Austen? So this was one of the this book I wrote to redress that balance, because Amelia Bassano-Lanier is an incredible woman. As a woman writer in England during her time, she faced an incredible handicap. The only genre considered acceptable for women to write was religious verse, specifically Protestant poetry. And she turned this genre on its head because in 1611 she published her epic poem, Salve Deus Rex Judaeorum, Hail God, King of the Jews, which is nothing short than a vindication of the rights of women couched as religious poetry.
Yeah. And so from that, you have really brought someone out that probably, like you said, very few of us would have had any idea even existed.
Exactly. Yeah, she was actually lost in the mists of history. She was her life and work kind of faded into obscurity, and she was only rediscovered in the 1970s, which is very sad. So I want to make sure she never is forgotten again.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's something that I admire about how you choose to do what you do.
Oh, thank you.
And the focus of it, yeah. Moving on, I'm very interested in when I heard you talk about your process and about the length of time that it takes for you to go maybe from inception and that arc to completion, being about a 4-year time span. I'd love to hear a little more about that.
Well, more of a 4-year time span with all my research and so forth. But yeah, I think I spend at least as much time on research as I do on the writing. And for The Dark Lady's Mask, it involved a lot of travel to Italy, specifically Venice and Bassano. Emilia Bassano Lanier was a woman of Italian Jewish heritage. Her father was driven out of his hometown of Bassano, which gave the family their name because he was Jewish. And that involved like going to Bassano, going to the city archives, going to the Jewish ghetto in Venice, and it's just an incredible history there.
And it's an incredible feat for a writer to, I mean, obviously, you know, there's so many different genres and way of writing, but this is incredibly, I think, intense, and it must be very personal for you, I would think, too.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it is very, very personal. I really care about my characters. If you spend 4 years writing and researching a novel, you really kind of live inside your character's skin.
Exactly.
And I think maybe you enter them even more deeply than like academic biographers do, because it feels so personal. You're trying to get in touch with their emotions and their whole kind of character arc and their motivations. You just feel like you're really inside their skin.
Very much so. And you know, I wondered as I was thinking about and hearing this process the other day for the first time, and the length and the intensity that you have with your developing your characters and getting to know them. Of those that you've written about so far, is there anyone that's still lives within you that maybe, you know, I'm sure maybe each one has a place in your heart, but is there one that maybe you call on or you think about, or, you know, what happens after you sort of metaphorically close that book and move on and it, you know, that baby has been birthed? Do you have any sense of them continuing on with you in your daily life, or how does that work? You know?
Well, they totally continue on with me in my daily life. In 2010, I published Daughters of the Witching Hill.
Yes.
And that's very personal to me because this is based on the true story of the Pendle witches of 1612. And I live in this area of northern England near Pendle Hill where they lived. And so their story like literally unfolded in my backyard. And it's almost like the ancestral voices in the land were telling the story over and over again. And I felt like telling the story of Mother Demdike, this accused witch who was a cunning woman, a healer of long-standing repute. It's almost like through the voice of the land, she was telling me her own story, and it was my job to write down in her voice. That's a story that I had to tell in first person because this really strong, compelling voice came out, and it seemed really tied to this particular land and this environment. So that was very magical in every sense of the word.
Very much so,
Yeah.
Was that a unique experience, having a character come to you sort of in that way?
Oh, very much so. Yeah, it was a really organic experience, and like riding my horse through the environs of Pendle Hill and, you know, thinking that this is where my characters once walked and lived. It was really special.
Yeah, it's profound. And like you said, the connection with the land and that it's your dwelling place.
Yes.
And so, I mean, obviously that's one way that you're every time you see that, you know, and
yes.
It's a very alive thing, you know. It almost probably doesn't feel historical in some ways because it is still there in and around you, you know, in your pores almost.
Yeah, it's almost the drama is still happening and they're still there. They're not going to leave that landscape anytime soon.
Yes, that's a beautiful story, which the next time we visit, I hope to talk more about that particular book. But there's so much that you have done and are doing, and with the advent of The Dark Lady coming out, I wanted to make sure we gave her her due time in this visit. Some other things that were really interesting to me as I was learning more about you is your journey as a woman, as Mary, your journey as a developing writer, and then your journey into feminism, which is something that I know is important to you. I know that you are a featured blogger with, is it Feminism and Religion?
Yes, the Feminism and Religion website, which is really excellent.
Yeah, so I'd love to hear about how did this transpire over the course of your own life to be where and what it is today?
Well, I was always interested in feminism. I studied women's history in college, And I really wanted to go into history. I ended up studying German studies with a history emphasis and then English literature, and I ended up living in Germany for a very long time, which is one of the reasons how I came to write the Hildegard von Bingen novel. But I had such a strong attraction to history, and then I thought that, like I said before, historical fiction is such an accessible way into history. Specifically with Hildegard, people told me that she's such an iconic figure and so many people admire her, but most of the books written about her are for this very kind of elite academic audience, and people struggle to find an accessible book about her. I mean, Matthew Fox has written accessible books about her, but an accessible fiction book that just tells her story where you get to know her as a character,
Right.
I think that was unique, and I think that's why Illuminations touched so many people, because they wanted to know her in a very tangible way, and I hope that my novel enabled them to do so.
Absolutely. And in terms of your own unfoldment, I'm imagining your connection with her must have been pretty extraordinary,
Yes.
because she's such a unique woman in history.
Oh, she's incredible, just a powerhouse, and I
You
like
call her Powerfrau?
Powerfrau. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
my
I
favorite
love
word,
that.
Powerfrau. Invent a new word to describe Hildegard. She just, she was a Benedictine abbess, a healer, a composer, a philosopher, a visionary theologian,
Yeah.
a prophetess. I mean, what wasn't she? She was so incredible.
Well, I guess you did humanize her quite a bit for me, because I have done some of the Matthew Fox reading and some of, like you said, the loftier bits. But
Yeah.
one thing I didn't really realize was about how she was really in her, for her time, it would have been her later ages, for us middle age,
Yes.
before she kind of really hit her stride and was freed to do that. It didn't hit me until I read your depiction of her, about her being an anchorite and what that really involved, and how she spent, the first 30 some odd years of her life in that way, and then not until she was, I think of it as being freed and, really
Yeah.
founded her own abbey, that she was able to do what, I suppose, in a way, I think of as what she came here to do, or what she
Yes.
was chosen to do, perhaps,
Yeah.
And so for people like me who stayed home to raise my son, and I think about my vocation and working
Yeah.
with women, it was fascinating to see her strength and her courage and her passion for her vocation, or her calling, her avocation,
Yeah.
and how compelling it was. And it's really, here's someone in the 12th century that, as you said, she has such a wide appeal to all people, but in
Yes.
contemporary society as well. And you just never know where someone's story is going to hit you and inspire you. So she
Yeah.
continues to inspire me in many ways. But I learned things by reading your book that really tweaked my connection with her even more. So that was a real
excellent.
gift. Yeah,
Oh,
real
that's
gift.
the greatest thing for an
Right?
author to hear. Yeah.
I mean, it really did maybe cover some of those bases that you were hoping. Just an ordinary person being able to connect with her in a
Yes.
very real way.
Excellent.
Yeah, and a couple other things that really have fascinated me about your work and your website and some of your history is what you write about fairy tales and women.
Yes.
Yeah, and some of the darker women in fairy tales, like
Yeah.
Baba Yaga.
Yes.
And some of the archetypes
Yeah.
that are, I think, important for women to know about, and kind of let them get under their skin a little bit, and how you really had maybe you can speak to, put it in your own words, but I'll paraphrase about how maybe fairy tales have been lightened or watered down, and
yes.
they're really a teaching tool that I think are coming back into our world in greater and greater ways these days. I think the
Yeah.
power of those archetypes are really rising in our awareness, and
Yeah.
you speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, in the traditional fairy tales, I mean, if you read Grimm's uncensored fairy tales, they're really raw. They're full of like violence and death, and they don't always have happy endings.
Right.
I mean, the Disney fairy tales have been really watered down, but if you read them in their pure, unadulterated form, they're absolutely wild. And they arise in every culture, not just the German fairy tales from the Grimm's brothers, but also the Russian fairy tales like Baba Yaga. And what's interesting is the female archetypes that arise in them, because there's this innocent maiden like Vasilisa and Baba Yaga, and it's usually this innocent young girl, and then who she encounters in the fairy tale is this raw, untamed, wild feminine archetype, like Baba Yaga in the Russian tradition, or Frau Holle in the German tradition, who has fangs. She can be very beautiful, but she also has teeth. And I think it's maybe a manifestation of mythological, goddess archetypes that were suppressed by, when these earlier mythologies died, these archetypes lived on in the fairy tales, and they remained uncensored over the years because fairy tales were dismissed as children's stories or old wives' stories, but they're teaching tales with very, very powerful, raw, untamed feminine archetypes that inspire us today.
And you take that to another place as well, because you talk about us writing our fairy tales or taking inspiration from these. And what would our fairy tale look like if we did that as women? And I found sort of organically over the years, I do that at times at different periods in time where I'm really looking for something I want to pull on that maybe is below the surface. In either first or third person, I'll write. In fairy tale fashion about my experience or what I'm wanting to create or what I'm working through or healing. So I have found it an extremely valuable experience to work in that way.
Wonderful.
And I want to share that because I think that our Circle Magica community should really know about some of these, like you use the word accessible, ways for these powerhouse energies that live within us and around us, and that are amazing. In terms of, like you talk about the wild woman archetype, and the raw power that is available that so many of us have been either talked out of, never known about. It has been coerced away from us, brainwashed, as you said, watered down. And so I think in this age that we live in, I'm noticing a huge sort of grassroots rebirth of these energies all around us, and it's really something that when I saw that you were bringing that out for anybody that happens on your website, I really loved that it was there and could really I want to let people know that that is something available to them to learn a little bit more about. And if you would give us your website.
It's www.marysharratt.com. It's just basically my name. Mary Sharratt, spelled without punctuation.com. And you can email me via my website. You can friend me on Facebook and Twitter and go to my blog, and I'm happy to answer email and so forth.
Fantastic. And before we close, because I know there's a lot that you've been up to, and you've had a fantastic and busy time here in New England, which we're thrilled to have you. Very thrilled to have you.
It's exciting times here.
Very much so, yes. There was one thing that really touched me, which was something that you wrote and something that I think I want to finish up with. In your writing Through a Dark Forest that was a writing on your website, and it is really about the heroine's path and the heroine's journey and yours, and the way that you put some of the I think it's what you finished up with your closing statement maybe really hit home with me, and I think that it's something I'd like to share with the community too, about understanding that inner rootedness that we all have, and that it's so easy for that to be something that we lose touch with in the kind of crazy, chaotic, busy world that we live in. I think women so often get pulled out of themselves, and oftentimes in their journeys they're feeling scattered outwardly, but really this sense of self-connection and inner rootedness is something that we can return to, and that it's something that you spoke of really that being the place that you come from. You've established that place and it's your core. So to finish, I want to read it if I may.
Oh, please.
Yeah. So the piece that I'd like to share goes like this. The culmination of my heroine's journey is the realization that the true meaning of home, identity, and belonging goes deeper than geography and ethnicity. It is a deep inner rootedness. It is finding that house in the forest that exists inside your deepest self. And before we say goodbye today, is there anything that you would like to share with the community about your writing, about anything you have upcoming with projects that you're working on? What's going on with you after you head back to Northern England?
Well, I would love to hear from anybody who reads The Dark Lady's Mask. It's out in stores and available now. And I'm running a campaign on Twitter at hashtag Ophelia Reads. This is Ophelia, the feminist plague rat, who I met at Shakespeare's Globe in London. And so you can win prizes. You just have to take a picture of yourself reading my book, The Dark Lady's Mask, and post it on hashtag Ophelia Reads. And you could win the audiobook of The Dark Lady's Mask, and you could also win a very special botanical perfume a friend of mine designed called The Dark Lady.
Very nice.
And the contest ends August 1st. And then as the final closing note, I'll say Hildegard's message for the midlife power frau. Life begins at 42.
Nice.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Deb.
Really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it. Yeah. And so until we meet again, my Circle Magica community, I wish you the blessings of the green and the wild.